It started with a sentence that didn't sound dangerous. It wasn't sharp, or cruel, or even emotional. It was said in the same tone she used when reminding me to buy milk or telling me the weather had changed. We were standing in the kitchen, nothing important happening, no tension in the air, when she looked at me and said it. One sentence. Calm. Almost thoughtful. I remember nodding at first, because on the surface it didn't demand a reaction. It didn't accuse me of anything. It didn't ask for permission. It simply existed, hanging between us like an ordinary fact. And yet, the moment it landed, something inside me shifted, as if the floor had moved half an inch without warning. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't harmless. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily they were spoken, as if their weight had already been decided somewhere else, without me. For a few seconds after she said it, I stayed quiet. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself this was how misunderstandings were born, from men reading too much into normal conversations. She went on with her evening, opened a drawer, checked her phone, moved through the room the way she always did. Nothing else changed. That was what unsettled me most. The house didn't react. The walls didn't echo. There was no dramatic pause, no music cue, no clear signal that something important had just happened. But I felt it anyway, a small internal recoil, like realizing too late that you missed a step on the stairs. I replayed the sentence in my head, stripping it down, testing it from different angles, trying to hear it the way an outsider would. Each time, it sounded reasonable. Each time, it also felt wrong, in a way I couldn't yet explain. What confused me wasn't fear, but disorientation. I suddenly wasn't sure where I stood in my own marriage, or if standing was even the right word anymore. There was no anger in me, no jealousy, no sense of betrayal I could point to. Just a quiet awareness that something had been reframed without my consent. That sentence had drawn a line somewhere I hadn't known existed, and I had found myself on one side of it without moving. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask her to clarify. I smiled, answered something neutral, and let the moment pass, because I didn't yet know what I was reacting to. All I knew was that from that second on, I would never hear her words the same way again, and although I couldn't explain why, I understood that this was the beginning of something I would only recognize much later, when the meaning finally caught up with me. Before anything changed, our marriage was the kind people rarely talk about because there was nothing dramatic to explain. It was quiet, predictable, and, for a long time, deeply reassuring. We woke up at similar hours, moved around each other without friction, shared meals without needing distractions. There were no daily declarations of love, no constant need for reassurance, just the steady understanding that we were on the same side of life. I trusted her without effort, the way you trust the floor beneath your feet without checking it every morning. She was not impulsive or emotional in the way stories usually describe wives who bring chaos with them. She thought things through, spoke carefully, and avoided unnecessary conflict. When problems came up, they were handled with conversations, not explosions. That was why I believed in us so completely, because nothing about our relationship felt unstable or fragile. It felt earned. Our routines were simple, almost boring from the outside, but they gave structure to everything else. Weekdays had their rhythm, weekends their slower pace. What confused me wasn't fear, but disorientation. I suddenly wasn't sure where I stood in my own marriage, or if standing was even the right word anymore. There was no anger in me, no jealousy, no sense of betrayal I could point to. Just a quiet awareness that something had been reframed without my consent. That sentence had drawn a line somewhere I hadn't known existed, and I had found myself on one side of it without moving. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask her to clarify. I smiled, answered something neutral, and let the moment pass, because I didn't yet know what I was reacting to. All I knew was that from that second on, I would never hear her words the same way again, and although I couldn't explain why, I understood that this was the beginning of something I would only recognize much later, when the meaning finally caught up with me. Before anything changed, our marriage was the kind people rarely talk about because there was nothing dramatic to explain. It was quiet, predictable, and, for a long time, deeply reassuring. We woke up at similar hours, moved around each other without friction, shared meals without needing distractions. There were no daily declarations of love, no constant need for reassurance, just the steady understanding that we were on the same side of life. I trusted her without effort, the way you trust the floor beneath your feet without checking it every morning. She was not impulsive or emotional in the way stories usually describe wives who bring chaos with them. She thought things through, spoke carefully, and avoided unnecessary conflict. When problems came up, They were handled with conversations, not explosions. That was why I believed in us so completely, because nothing about our relationship felt unstable or fragile. It felt earned. Our routines were simple, almost boring from the outside, but they gave structure to everything else. Weekdays had their rhythm, weekends their slower pace. We knew each other's habits well enough to anticipate moods without asking. If I was quiet, she gave me space. If she was distant, I didn't assume the worst. There was a mutual respect for emotional boundaries that made our life feel balanced. We didn't live in each other's heads, but we didn't feel separate either. We planned months ahead, talked about the future without hesitation, and made decisions as if there was no alternative version of life where the other person wasn't present. Nothing felt temporary. Nothing felt conditional. What mattered most was the absence of fear. I never felt like I had to compete for her attention or prove my place in her life. She didn't test me, didn't threaten to leave, didn't use silence as a weapon. Disagreements ended without scorekeeping. Apologies were given without pride. From the inside, it felt like a partnership built on trust rather than passion alone, and I believed that was stronger. Looking back, I understand why it made everything that followed so disorienting. This wasn't a marriage that was already cracking. There were no warning signs anyone could point to and say, "Of course it happened." That illusion of stability is what made me lower my guard completely, certain that whatever challenges came, they would come from the outside, not from within the quiet, reasonable life we had built together. The first time she mentioned him, it didn't register as anything important. We were talking about something unrelated, one of those passing conversations that filled the space between dinner and sleep, when she paused and said she had heard from someone she hadn't spoken to in a long time. She didn't emphasize the words or lower her voice. There was no tension in her expression, no hesitation that would suggest this was a subject she'd been avoiding. She simply added that he hadn't been doing well lately, that life had been harder for him than she expected, and that it made her feel strangely unsettled. The way she spoke wasn't nostalgic or emotional, but thoughtful, almost responsible, as if she were explaining why a distant piece of news had stayed with her longer than it should have. I listened without interrupting, waiting for the part that would justify my attention, but it never came. She framed it as concern, nothing more. They hadn't spoken in years, she said. Their lives had gone in different directions. Whatever they once were belonged firmly in the past. This wasn't about reopening anything, just acknowledging that someone who had once mattered was struggling now. I remember nodding, because the explanation made sense. It fit the person I believed her to be, empathetic, reasonable, not driven by unresolved emotions. I even said something supportive, something about how it was normal to care about people you once knew, that it didn't mean anything beyond that. At the time, dismissing it felt like maturity, like trust in action rather than blind optimism. What I didn't notice then was how naturally his presence had entered our space. Not physically, not emotionally in any obvious way, but as a topic that didn't need justification. She didn't ask if it bothered me, and I didn't think to say that it might. There was no reason to. Everything about the moment suggested closure, not return. Yet later that night, lying awake for reasons I couldn't explain, I replayed the conversation again, not because of what she said, but because of how easy it had been to say it. There was no awkwardness, no careful framing, no sign that she feared how I might react. It felt settled already, as if the meaning of his existence in her life had been resolved without my participation. I told myself I was reading too much into it. People mention their past all the time, I thought. It's only a problem if you make it one. So I let it go, consciously pushing the thought aside, choosing trust over suspicion. Still, somewhere beneath that decision, a quiet awareness took shape, subtle and unformed, the sense that this wasn't a single mention, but an opening. Not a threat, not yet, just a small door left unlocked, one that didn't cause alarm on its own, but made it impossible to ignore the thought that it might be opened again. The request came a few days later, slipped into conversation with the same calm tone she used for everything else, and that was what made it difficult to react to. She didn't sit me down or prepare me for it. She didn't frame it as something sensitive. She simply said that with the holidays coming up, it felt wrong to ignore someone who had no one to spend them with, that it was a temporary situation, just a few days, nothing that would affect us in any real way. She spoke as if she had already walked through every possible objection and found none worth stopping for. This wasn't about reopening the past, she explained. It wasn't about emotion or nostalgia. It was about doing the decent thing, the human thing, the thing that showed maturity rather than insecurity. As she talked, I felt an unfamiliar tension settle in my chest, not sharp enough to call fear, not loud enough to justify resistance. I understood every word she said, and that was the problem. On paper, the request was reasonable. It was limited in time, framed by empathy, surrounded by assurances that nothing had changed between us. She reminded me that trust had always been the foundation of our marriage, that we had never policed each other's pasts, that we were stronger than situations like this. I wanted to agree with her, because disagreeing meant questioning something fundamental about how we had always operated. Yet even as I listened, a quiet alarm went off somewhere I couldn't locate, warning me that this wasn't about logistics or kindness, but about proximity, about presence, about allowing something unresolved to step closer than it ever had before. I tried to articulate what bothered me, but every thought collapsed under scrutiny. Saying no felt petty, as if I were punishing someone for circumstances that had nothing to do with me. Saying yes felt like surrendering something I couldn't name. I searched for a clear reason, a boundary I could point to and defend, but all I found was a feeling, and feelings are poor evidence when everything else appears reasonable. She watched me carefully, not defensively, not impatiently, just waiting, confident that I would arrive at the same conclusion she already had. In that moment, I became aware of the imbalance, subtle but undeniable, the way the decision had shifted into my hands only after the moral framing had been completed. I nodded slowly, not in agreement but in hesitation, buying time I didn't know how to use. I didn't want to be the person who stood in the way of compassion. I didn't want to be the husband whose first response was suspicion. At the same time, I felt something slipping, a small but significant piece of ground giving way beneath my feet. Whatever I chose would define the shape of what came next, and as I sat there weighing the cost of refusal against the cost of consent, I understood that this was no longer a neutral moment. It was a line I was being asked to step over quietly, and once crossed, there would be no pretending it had never been there. After that, nothing happened all at once, and that was what made it so difficult to name. There was no moment I could point to and say this is where it changed. Instead, it unfolded quietly, through small adjustments that were easy to overlook and even easier to excuse. She was still present, still attentive in practical ways, still kind. But something in her attention had shifted direction. Conversations that once unfolded naturally between us began to feel shorter, less complete, as if she were finishing them out of habit rather than interest. She listened, but her focus drifted. I noticed pauses where there hadn't been any before, brief checks of her phone, a subtle delay before responding, like her thoughts were elsewhere even while her body remained in the room. At first, I told myself it was temporary. The holidays were stressful. Everyone was distracted. I reminded myself of the trust we had built, the calm logic that had always guided us through uncertainty. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, no secretive behavior that demanded confrontation. And yet, I began to feel as though I was speaking slightly too late, arriving half a second after the conversation had already moved on. She shared less of her inner world with me, not in a dramatic withdrawal, but in a gradual narrowing. Stories came with less detail. Reactions felt measured, careful, as if she were choosing which parts of herself to bring home and which to leave elsewhere. I became aware of a new pattern, subtle enough that I doubted it even as I recognized it. When something meaningful happened in her day, I was no longer the first person to hear about it. When she was quiet, it wasn't the comfortable silence we had always known, but something private, sealed. I found myself watching her more than speaking, trying to understand the rhythm of this new distance, unsure when it had become normal for me to wait for her attention rather than share it. There were moments when she smiled at something I couldn't see, moments when her emotional energy seemed already spent by the time it reached me. What hurt most was the absence of anything I could challenge. There was no betrayal to accuse, no rule broken, no promise explicitly violated. The marriage still existed in form, but the center of it felt hollowed out, like a room slowly emptied of its furniture while the walls remained standing. I began to feel less like a participant and more like a witness, present for the structure but excluded from the meaning. That was when it became clear that something was being taken from me, something that didn't leave marks or evidence, something I couldn't recover by arguing or demanding. It was intangible, but its absence was undeniable, and I understood, with a quiet certainty, that whatever this was, it could not be returned simply by pretending it wasn't happening. The moment of awareness didn't arrive with a discovery or a confrontation, but with something far smaller and far more final. It happened one evening when I asked her a simple question, the kind that used to open long conversations between us, and she answered with a tone that was careful, almost rehearsed, as if she were choosing words meant to close the subject rather than explore it. There was no irritation in her voice, no impatience, just a gentle finality that hadn't been there before. I realized then that she wasn't protecting herself from me, she was protecting something else from entering the space we once shared. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or tense, which made it worse. It was complete, self-contained, and it didn't invite me in. In that quiet, a thought settled with unexpected clarity. I was no longer the person she processed things with. I was the person she reported things to, after they had already been understood elsewhere. I didn't feel anger when that realization formed. I felt a slow, sinking grief, the kind that arrives when you recognize a loss that has already happened. There was nothing to investigate, no message to uncover, no timeline to reconstruct. The evidence wasn't external, it was relational. I noticed it in how she no longer searched my face for reactions, in how my responses seemed optional rather than necessary. I noticed it in myself, too, in the way I hesitated before speaking, unsure whether my words would land anywhere meaningful. The intimacy hadn't vanished dramatically, it had been reassigned. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, no matter how normal everything else appeared. What made the certainty so heavy was its quietness. There was no argument to push back against, no denial to provoke reassurance. She hadn't done anything that could be challenged without sounding unreasonable. And yet, I understood with absolute precision that I was no longer central in the emotional structure of my own marriage. I was adjacent, informed, included in form but not in function. The grief came not from jealousy, but from displacement, from realizing that the role I had inhabited without question had been gently, almost kindly, reduced. I sat with that awareness longer than I expected, turning it over without urgency, because reacting too quickly felt like confirming a truth I wasn't ready to act on. Confronting her would force everything into words she might not even recognize. Withdrawing would change me into someone I didn't want to become. Waiting meant accepting a position that felt increasingly unreal. None of the options promised relief, only different kinds of loss. And as I considered them, I understood that the moment itself had already changed me. Whatever I chose next would no longer be about saving the marriage as it was, but about deciding how much of myself I was willing to set aside while pretending nothing had shifted. When we finally spoke about it, there was no tension in the room, and that absence made the conversation feel heavier than any argument could have. I didn't accuse her or raise my voice. I asked careful questions, the kind meant to understand rather than trap, and she answered in the same measured way she had begun using for everything else. She said she didn't feel that anything inappropriate was happening, that nothing had crossed a line she could clearly see. When I asked what she felt, she paused, searching for language that wouldn't commit her to anything definitive. She said she was confused, that emotions don't always follow logic, that it was possible to care about more than one person in different ways without meaning harm. Each response was calm, reasonable, and incomplete, like a series of explanations designed to soften reality without denying it outright. I listened closely, not just to the words, but to what they avoided. Whenever the conversation drifted toward the impact on our marriage, she gently redirected it toward her own uncertainty, her need to understand herself, her fear of making the wrong choice. She said she didn't want to lose anyone, that pushing someone away felt cruel, that life was complicated and didn't always offer clean solutions. There was no apology, because in her mind nothing irreversible had been done. There was no promise to change, because that would have required her to admit that something needed to be undone. The clarity came not from what she confessed, but from what she protected. She was willing to sit with my discomfort, but not with the idea of letting go of the connection that caused it. As the conversation continued, I felt something settle into place with quiet finality. I understood that asking her to choose would turn me into the antagonist of her own story, the person demanding sacrifice rather than offering understanding. I could stay, but only by shrinking my expectations, by accepting uncertainty as a permanent condition, by learning to live with an emotional hierarchy in which I was no longer at the center. The realization didn't arrive with anger, but with a profound disappointment, the kind that drains energy rather than ignites it. I saw clearly then that nothing she was saying would change, because from her perspective, nothing had to. When the conversation ended, there was no resolution, just a calm agreement to let things continue as they were for the moment. She seemed relieved by that, as if the absence of conflict meant progress. I felt the opposite. Walking away from that conversation, I knew that staying would require me to erase parts of myself quietly, to accept less without calling it loss, to redefine loyalty until it no longer resembled what I had believed in. That understanding didn't demand an immediate decision, but it marked a point of no return. From that moment on, remaining in the marriage would no longer be an act of love, but an act of disappearance. The decision didn't come in a dramatic moment, and it didn't feel like courage so much as inevitability. I didn't announce anything or demand change. I simply stopped trying to correct a situation that no longer had room for me in the way it once had. The clarity from our conversation stayed with me, steady and unemotional, and over the next days it quietly rearranged my priorities. I began to imagine a version of myself that wasn't constantly measuring his place, waiting for reassurance, or translating silence into hope. That version felt calmer, lighter, even if the path toward it was unclear. So I made a private choice, not to punish or provoke, but to preserve what was left of my self-respect. It wasn't about leaving immediately or packing bags, it was about withdrawing my emotional investment from a structure that no longer returned it. Nothing on the surface changed enough to alarm her. I was still polite, still present, still functioning within the shared routines. But I stopped reaching for conversations that required vulnerability. I stopped offering understanding where it was used to justify imbalance. I listened without filling in gaps, responded without over-explaining, and allowed pauses to remain empty. This wasn't strategy, it was restraint. For the first time in months, I wasn't trying to fix the discomfort or smooth it over. I let it exist. The calm that followed surprised me. Without the constant internal negotiation, my thoughts became clearer, less reactive. I wasn't angry or bitter. I felt resolved, as if I had finally stopped arguing with reality. She noticed the change, but misunderstood it. She asked if I was tired, if work had been stressful, if something else was bothering me. I answered honestly but briefly, giving her no conflict to manage and no reassurance to lean on. From her perspective, things were stable again, quieter, easier. She didn't see the shift as a warning, she saw it as adaptation. That was the most revealing part. The absence of resistance felt to her like agreement, not departure. She didn't recognize the seriousness of what was happening because seriousness had never been loud in our relationship. It had always lived in the quiet. As days passed, I felt myself becoming less entangled, less reactive to moments that once would have consumed my attention. The future began to look less like a negotiation and more like an open question, and for the first time, that didn't scare me. I wasn't waiting for her to realize anything, but I understood that realization, if it came, would arrive late and without ceremony. The decision I had made required no permission and no validation. It simply existed, firm and internal, shaping everything that followed. And as I moved through the familiar spaces of our life with a new distance, I knew the consequence was already set in motion, whether she recognized it yet or not. The consequences didn't arrive as confrontation or anger, but as absence, subtle and undeniable. She began to notice it in the small gaps where my presence had always been assumed. I didn't comment on every minor detail, didn't offer insight or reassurance, didn't fill silences with explanations. At first, she asked questions, lightly, testing if something was wrong, if I was upset, if I needed space. I answered calmly, without dramatics, without inviting further discussion, keeping the distance consistent but measured. Each time she reached toward me and found nothing to grasp, the quiet grew heavier. It wasn't punishment, it was simply the natural result of the choice I had made, the boundaries I had set and maintained without vindictiveness. That absence, more than anything, was its own statement. Regret started appearing in unexpected moments, not in confessions or apologies, but in hesitation, in the way she lingered in conversation without saying what she might have said before, in the pauses where she had once trusted me to meet her emotionally. She seemed to realize too late that the space I had withdrawn into was not temporary, not negotiable, not a test she could pass. She tried to reintroduce closeness with small gestures, polite concern, questions meant to draw me back, but the timing was wrong, the form insufficient. My boundaries were no longer negotiable, and I could see her struggling to understand that. There was no drama, no accusations, no shouting, but there was unmistakable tension in the mismatch between what she wanted and what I had allowed. I could feel the irony in it. She was experiencing the emotional impact of my withdrawal, not because I sought revenge, but because the balance of our connection had already shifted. I maintained my calm, never letting frustration or anger show, never stepping outside the lines I had drawn for myself. Each interaction was deliberate, restrained, a reinforcement of the new reality. I didn't gloat, I didn't lecture, I didn't remind her of the choices that led here. I simply existed within the boundaries I had defined, consistent and unyielding. It was the quiet persistence of distance that carried weight, the absence that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. And in that quiet, I began to see the point where the story would diverge, whether she would recognize what had been lost in time to try and reclaim it, or whether I would continue forward, preserving the version of myself that demanded respect over reconciliation. The choice was no longer theoretical, it was the reality I had constructed with patience and clarity, and as I navigated each day, the weight of it settled around both of us like an invisible but unbreakable line. Looking back, the most striking part of all this wasn't the absence of physical betrayal, because there was none. There was no infidelity in the traditional sense, no secret meetings or whispered lies. What existed was quieter, subtler, yet no less devastating, an emotional displacement that shifted the foundation of a life I thought was shared. It arrived without proof, without spectacle, and for a long time I doubted whether I had the right to feel betrayed at all. But betrayal doesn't always wear the clothing we expect. It can be as understated as a glance that lingers elsewhere, a silence that stretches longer than it should, a presence in the same room that no longer includes you. I learned that trust and intimacy can be eroded not just by dramatic acts, but by the slow, quiet redirection of attention and care, and that such losses are every bit as real as any visible infidelity. In the months that followed, I came to understand self-respect in a way I hadn't before. It isn't loud or performative. It doesn't demand acknowledgement or apology. It is a boundary maintained quietly, a refusal to allow your own worth to be diminished even when the world around you pretends nothing has changed. I recognized that staying, pretending nothing had shifted, would have required erasing pieces of myself I couldn't afford to lose. Leaving, or withdrawing emotionally, was not an act of punishment, but an affirmation of the value I placed on my own presence and integrity. There is a certain calm that comes with such a decision, a steady clarity that allows life to move forward without resentment or theatrics, and it is in that quiet acceptance that I discovered strength I had not known I possessed. I also reflected on the nature of relationships and the ways we measure loyalty and love. Emotional bonds are not less important than physical ones. They are the foundation on which intimacy, trust, and shared life are built. When that foundation is eroded, even in silence, the structure becomes fragile. I learned to recognize when the effort I invested was no longer reciprocated, when emotional energy was being quietly diverted elsewhere, and to distinguish between discomfort that is temporary and imbalance that is enduring. Understanding the difference, and acting on it without anger or vindictiveness, became a lesson in maturity, teaching me that clarity and boundaries are forms of care for oneself as much as any act of compassion toward others. The final takeaway is simple, but difficult to accept. Some losses are quiet, some betrayals are invisible, and some departures are unaccompanied by drama. Yet they are no less real, no less consequential. Protecting oneself does not require spectacle, it requires honesty, internal fortitude, and the courage to let go when what remains is not enough. Life continues, as it always does, and it is in the measured choices we make, about presence, attention, and respect, that we preserve our dignity and the possibility of authentic connection in the future. And perhaps the most universal truth I discovered is that emotional survival, self-respect, and quiet awareness are the most powerful forms of resilience we can offer ourselves, even when the love we once trusted quietly slips away without explanation or apology, leaving only lessons and the sober, unshakable knowledge of our own value.